Chapter VI, Principles of Industrial Relations, an outline formed by weaving together the main themes of the course on industrial relations in an arrangement to show the logical relationship of the ideas. Industrialism. 1. Industrialism is a manner of economic life by which organized groups of men, utilizing machinery and the resources of science, produce commodities for the market and gain their livelihoods from the proceeds of the sale of these commodities. 2. Industrial relations arise out of these organizations of men, in which individuals subordinate themselves to the institution, assuming certain obligations or duties and enjoying certain privileges or rights. Institutions are composed of relations in the form of reciprocal rights and duties. 3. In industrial or business institutions, relations are based on contract. A contract is a voluntary arrangement of reciprocal rights and duties. 4. Industrial institutions coordinate the activities of men so as to realize productive efficiency and achieve economic welfare. 5. Under industrialism, economic welfare is realized by means of livelihoods obtained almost universally by the expenditure of incomes. 6. Incomes are fragments of purchasing power derived from the splitting up or distribution of revenues. 7. Revenues are created by business institutions which operate industry. 8. In operating to create revenues, business institutions incidentally produce commodities, or wealth which is divided up into livelihoods. 9. This system, by which society relies upon voluntary enterprise to organize the resources of the country for the social-economic welfare, runs into this dilemma. Organization and coordination beyond a certain point in any industry destroys competition. The economic regulator which automatically protects society against the evil consequences of the acquisitive self-interest of the business institution and the members thereof. On the other hand, the efforts to retain competition in full force as a public protector have restricted collective coordination in industry to the great sacrifice of social efficiency. 2. Business organization. Contractual relations of parties. 1. Business institutions which operate industry are voluntary associations of individuals organized for the purpose collectively of acquiring revenue and individually of earning incomes. Because the main purpose of business is acquisition, the system is called commercialism. Business is a mere scheme of administrative arrangements for the organization of industry. 2. There are usually 4 classes of members in the organization: proprietors, managers, investors, and workers. 3. Proprietors assume the responsibility for creating and maintaining the institution, and it is their property, subject to more or less government regulation. 4. Managers are employed by contract with the proprietors to administer the institution as agents of the proprietors with delegated authority. 5. Investors contribute the services of their property under an investment contract which gives them a claim on the institution. 6. Workers contribute their personal services under the wage contract which creates certain reciprocal duties and rights between themselves and the institution. 7. The total revenues of the business institution are dispersed to parties having contractual claims upon it. Any residue becomes profit, an accretion to the property of the proprietor. Any deficit becomes a loss, a deduction from the property of the proprietor. 8. That part of the disbursement of revenue which by contract goes as income to management becomes salaries, to investors becomes interest and dividend, to workers becomes wages. 3. Finance or industrial control. 1. Business institutions are the property of their proprietors and are esteemed or valued according to their profit-sharing efficiency. This process of evaluation is called capitalization. Capital is any property right which is the source of income. 2. The proprietor's interest or property in a business institution is disclosed by the balance sheet, exhibiting the assets or total property and the liabilities or claims or investors and other parties against the assets. The difference is the net worth or proprietor's interest. 3. The administration of the relationships indicated on the balance sheet is financing and is a function of proprietorship. The success of business operations is measured ultimately by net profits, either distributed as dividends or added to assets as surplus. In either case, profits increase the property of the proprietors. 4. Business institutions enlarge either by increments of surplus from their own operations or by securing capital contributions from investors. Such contributions have their origin in savings from incomes or from surplus. 5. The industrial operations of the institution are administered with regard to financial considerations. This frequently gives the financial interest the ultimate decision as to industrial relations policies. IV. Opportunity and prosperity. 1. The economic opportunity of all classes is determined by general conditions, both natural and financial, favorable to the spirit of enterprise and the extent to which enterprise is functioning. Opportunity is created by enterprise. 2. Opportunity must take the form of jobs or investments before an individual can utilize his capacity for service or his property to gain a livelihood. Jobs and investments are the sources of income, which is the means to a livelihood. 3. The amount of enterprise is dependent upon individuals with a willingness, ability, and prestige to organize and maintain business institutions in a condition or a prospect of relative prices wherein profits are more probable than losses. 4. When enterprise is abundant, the quantity and quality of both jobs and investments is enhanced. Incomes are greater, and livelihoods become more satisfactory by reason of the enlarged production of want-satisfying things or wealth. This condition is called prosperity. 5. Prosperity, however, tends to destroy itself by inflation, speculative maladjustment of prices, inefficiency of labor, and unwise organization and management of business institutions. This counteraction produces crises and depressions. 6. The rhythmic swing from prosperity to depression and back again constitute the business cycle, which is responsible for dissatisfaction with the business system and resulting in bankruptcies, strikes, profiteering, unemployment, and the whole train of economic evils. The management. 1. As business institutions enlarge, there is a tendency for the proprietors to turn over the administration to managers and themselves sink into the position of investors. 2. The efficiency of management is measured by its success in promoting the interests of the proprietors. The function of management is the adjustment of contractual relations with the members of the business institution and with outside parties, customers, banks, purveyors, etc. By this means, coordination is achieved. 3. The authority of management is normally derived from the proprietors, and therefore its responsibility is naturally to the same parties. Whatever responsibility it assumes toward other parties is proportionate to its estimate of the influence of such parties upon efficiency and success. This influence varies directly with economic power and pressure. There is a disposition of management to regard the business institution as an end in itself rather than as a social agency for human welfare. 4. With the change in conditions, change in the temper and education of workers, and in the discrimination of customers, etc., the rules for successful management change in the direction of wider service to employees and public. The extent to which enlightened public opinion and judgment and pressure can effect a reconciliation between self-interest of management and social welfare awaits further experimentation and development. VI. The wage contract. 1. Wage contracts agreed upon between management and workers create jobs. 2. The management endeavors to create jobs and make contracts with workers so as to realize the maximum of advantage to the business institution. 3. The workers endeavor to make contracts which will create jobs of maximum advantage to themselves. The important considerations are wages or income producing capacity of the job, the amount of employment provided by the job, hours or the amount of time they agree to contribute, tenure of the job or the economic security, conditions of the job or the physical and hygienic and social surroundings, the irksomeness and risk. 4. The process of negotiating a contract is bargaining, which may be either individual or collective. In large institutions, individual bargaining tends to become merely the acceptance or rejection of a standardized job, the conditions of which are determined by the employer. 5. Collective bargaining presupposes organization of workers, at least sufficient to select representatives or business agents to act for them. Organization of workers beyond a certain point takes the form of unions and creates the problem of unionism in industrial relations. 6. Collective bargaining tends to create standardized jobs also, but the considerations thereof are determined by joint agreement of management or representatives of the workers. 7. The labor problem. 1. The labor problem arises from the dissatisfaction of one or both parties to the wage contract. This dissatisfaction impairs the coordination essential to efficiency, and in the case of a strike destroys it altogether. 2. Dissatisfaction may be due to the specific terms and considerations of the jobs and the desire to improve matters by more efficient bargaining, or a distrust of the industrial system in general, and a desire for an entirely different system of industrial relations. This may extend to a distrust of the fundamental institutions of private property, communism, and of private enterprise, socialism. 3. The strike is a collective action of workers to force management to improve jobs. This action impairs or destroys coordination, thus creating a pressure upon management to yield to the workers. 4. This strike sacrifices the incomes of the workers and hazards the tenure of the jobs. In order to escape these disadvantages, workers sometimes endeavor to accomplish their purposes by sabotage, restrictions of output, striking on the job, etc. 5. In wage disputes, the strike is often merely withholding service pending the outcome of bargaining, and for the sake of strength in bargaining. 6. Dissatisfaction with the industrial system may take form of a general strike, not against the individual employer, but in order to paralyze industrial activity and provoke social revolution. Social. 8. Unionism. 1. Under the pressure of competition tending to reduce selling prices of product, proprietors desirous of enlarging, strengthening, and enriching their business institutions stimulate their managements to even greater efficiency and lower relative costs. 2. This constant pressure tends to impair the quantity and quality of the jobs to the disadvantage of the workers. The competition among workers for the jobs they see accelerates this tendency. 3. Resistance to this tendency, therefore, begins with diminishing the competition among workers and inducing the individuals to merge with others into an organization or union in order to realize the multiplied economic bargaining power which lies in unity. 4. The reluctance of the individual to sacrifice his freedom required by unionism must be overcome by prospects of improved jobs or by an appeal to class loyalty enforced by public opinion. The scab is a worker not amenable to collective action. Class solidarity is produced by consciousness of group interest and of antagonism of one group to others. 5. Unionism attempts to standardize jobs by maintaining economic strength enough to discourage the tendency of management to gain in efficiency at the expense of the workers. The strike or the threat of a strike is the means employed. IX. Open versus closed shop. 1. Unionism is an effort to gain economic power by organization of human interests and wills. Like all institutions, the accumulated power may be employed for good or evil. It is a standing temptation to ambitious, unscrupulous, or fanatical men to use this power for their own purposes, and to well-meaning but ignorant men to use it unwisely. 2. Unionism restricts the freedom of management in its administration of industrial institutions, thereby discouraging enterprise, obstructing efficiency, interfering with the natural adjustments of prices and economic relations, and limiting the freedom of the workers. 3. The economic power of a union varies directly with the control it exercises over all the workers in the trade and industry. Therefore, it seeks to persuade or coerce all workers into the union and establish the closed shop, thus, through unemployment, driving refractory workers out of the industry. 4. Management resents the interference by the union with its freedom of administration and seeks to limit the power of the union by preventing the closed shop and maintaining an open shop in which non-union men may be employed. Sometimes the distrust and resentment go as far as a non-union shop policy. 5. General prosperity is favorable to unionism and depression unfavorable. When the supply of jobs is large relative to workers, there is greater courage and resources and less risk to the workers in pushing for greater power. During a depression, there is great pressure upon management to meet falling selling prices by reductions in costs. This condition stimulates resistance to unionism. X. Organized management. 1. The competitive system reinforced by the Sherman Antitrust Act and similar limiting legislation make it difficult for the managements of business institutions to organize for the regulation and standardization of industrial practice. The organization of labor, however, threatening to regulate and standardize in a manner inimical to the interests of management and the proprietors they represent, necessitates the organization of management to prevent union domination. 2. The reluctance of individual managements to sacrifice their freedom of action must be overcome by prospects of improved conditions or by an appeal to class loyalty enforced by public opinion. 3. In many business associations, The purpose is not at all or very incidentally the regulation of industrial relations. The purpose is likely to be civic betterment impelled by a sense of social responsibility of its members. There is practically always, however, a policy of economic conservation and a resistance to all proposals for radical changes in the system. 4. While some associations of industrial employers exist frankly for the purpose of maintaining exclusive control over the terms of the industrial relation, and are therefore hostile to unionism, many exist for the purpose of more efficient collective bargaining. 5. Whenever collective bargaining exists between powerful organizations of management and labor, there is danger that public welfare will be sacrificed. After all, management is the agent of the public, whether conscious of it or not, to hammer down costs, to eliminate waste, and to improve service, and any organization of either management or labor or both tends to impair the effectiveness of this system. XI. Union agreements. 1. When management voluntarily or under pressure is willing to permit a union to participate in the establishment and maintenance of standards of industrial relations. These standards are usually defined in means of interpretation and enforcement provided in a collective contract or agreement. 2. Because of the great difficulty and often impracticability of securing enforcement of these contracts through the courts, these agreements depend for enforcement upon the sense of moral responsibility of the parties or upon the advantage of keeping them inviolate. Changes of conditions, shifts in the relative strength of the parties, ambiguities or disputed interpretations, and inadequate provision for contingencies are the usual causes of breaks. 3. Scientifically, drawn agreements guard against breaches by providing an arbitrator or board to interpret and apply the instrument in all cases of dispute. Sometimes an administrative agency in the form of a labor department is set up by management to make the agreement more effective. 4. Union agreements, especially when they prescribe detailed rights and duties, tend to emphasize the contractual relationship and minimize the paternal or the master-servant relationship. The workers become more independent and litigious while insubordination and lack of loyalty to the employer are more tolerated. There is a pressure upon the union to assume more responsibility and even take over functions from management. Legal responsibility is sought to be enforced upon them by incorporation of unions. 5. Union agreements tend to crystallize relations and industrial processes generally. The effect of this loss of flexibility is to impede changes in the direction of efficiency and progress, discouraging to management. The penalty of standardization is red tape and dry rot. 9. 12. Arbitration in industrial law. 1. The interests of men living in contact tend to conflict in inverse proportion as they are material, intellectual, and spiritual. 2. Under primitive social conditions, these conflicts of interest are adjusted by force or cunning, thereby creating a condition of hatred, fear, arrogance, and destruction, fatal to needed cooperation and welfare. 3. Government was established to provide a substitute for this wasteful and unsatisfactory method. Definition of rights and standards of conduct were set up and enforced by some ruling power, whether autocrat, monarch, oligarchy, parliament, cabinet, or elected administration. 4. The judicial function of government was developed to interpret and apply the will of the ruling power, whether this were the personal will of the autocrat or the will of the people expressed in the form of law. 5. This adjustment of conflicts of interest by reference to standards is the essence of arbitration. 6. Arbitration may be voluntary or compulsory, wherever the state undertakes to regulate the relations of men. Arbitration is compulsory through the courts. In industrial relations, voluntary arbitration is the usual form and requires the consent of all the parties. Otherwise, their relations are adjusted by more primitive methods. 7. Arbitration decisions tend to conform to custom and usage and to create precedents which become standards and to which industry tends to adapt itself. By this means, the idea of industrial government and the rule of law or reason is introduced in industrial relations. 13. Voluntary adaptations to workers' interest. 1. The enlargement of humanitarianism, the louder expression of discontent of the workers, respect for the power of labor organization, the more complicated and delicate articulation of industry, the application of the scientific spirit to management, all these have made great changes in the policies and methods of management in the direction of better adjustments to social requirements. 2. As it became generally realized that militant unionism and the refractoriness of labor is a reflex of arbitrary and autocratic management, indifferent to the reasonable requirements of employees, enlightened management will be quick to investigate and experiment with methods of industrial relations more satisfactory to the others. 3. The irresistible tendency toward democracy is based on the great human desire for self-respect. Management is learning that it is poor policy to offend this feeling. Hence the general trend toward democratic adjustments, notably shop councils and employee representation. 4. The essential difficulties which hinder the development of enlightened methods are competitive conditions which, especially in relative small institutions, leave the management little freedom of choice. Employers' associations made necessary by the size and power of labor unions. The short-sightedness of unions in failing to cooperate with enlightened managements and even expressing a hostility toward them more bitter than toward the least enlightened employers. The natural law by which conditions tend through competition to sink to the level of the most unscrupulous and greedy employer, freezing out the generous-minded employer. The tendency of workers often to interpret generosity as weakness and to destroy it by attempting to take advantage of it. XIV. Scientific management and labor. 1. The fact that industry is administered by business institutions, the property of proprietors who are motivated by financial and commercial interests, gives to industrial relations the aspect of buying and selling, or the tendency to regard labor as a commodity, the price of which is determined by insider the same as other items of cost of production. 2. As industrial administration and large concerns came to be delegated more and more to salaried managers, these, under the influence of technical men and engineers, came to have a more scientific and professional attitude toward their functions. This is scientific management. 3. As businessmen naturally regard employees as commodities, so professional managers just as naturally regard them as machines. As the chief merit of commodities to the buyer is cheapness, so the chief merit of machines to the engineer is efficiency. This shift of viewpoint works a vital change in the relations of employer and employee. 4. Organized labor is opposed to either theory, insisting that industry should be administered for the benefit of the workers instead of for the profit of the proprietors or for the efficiency of the management. 5. As management becomes professionally conscious, there is a tendency to establish standards of conduct or a professional ethics. As the actual control and policy comes into their hands through the dissipation of the proprietary interest among thousands of stockholders, we may expect that social efficiency may trespass upon private profit as the guiding purpose of large business institutions of an industrial character. XV. Employee representation. 1. The rapid progress made by the idea of employee representation in shop committees during and after the war is evidence of the fear of the dangers of union domination, of the enlightenment of employers to the inadequacies of the old methods of management, and of the impression made by scientific management. 2. Employee representation is essentially a recognition of collective bargaining, where it provides for alternate bona fide arbitration in case of final disagreement between management and workers. It represents an abdication of autocratic authority by the proprietor and management. 3. Leadership among any group of people is inevitable. When management fails to fulfill this function satisfactorily, it is wise to seek the assistance of the natural leaders of the workers and to educate and inform them through discussion of industrial problems and relations. Otherwise, the leadership is likely to fall into hostile hands, often entirely outside the concern involved. 4. Suppression of the aspirations of the worker, especially when these have taken on a religious intensity and express an ethical idealism, even if successful, is likely to produce highly injurious consequences, not only social but detrimental to the industry itself. It is better to find for them a legitimate outlet and always seek to make an asset instead of a liability out of them. XVI. Labor management. 1. Every management should include some element, continuously functioning, sensitive to the just grievances of the employees, thoroughly informed at all times of the conditions of work and the relations between foremen and workers, understanding the economic and social tendencies of the times, resourceful in devising arrangements to meet difficulties, and tremendously interested in making the organization render the maximum of service to every person concerned, customers, proprietors, and managers, but equally with these, the workers. 2. Modern industrial conditions and complications are forcing management to functionalize itself. Different members specialize in some duty, such as sales management, auditing, cost accounting, scientific production control, etc. The handling of industrial relations is one of the latest functions to emerge as a special duty, and in most large industrial concerns we find an employment, personnel, service, or labor manager well established. 3. The function of this official varies widely according to the labor policy of the concern or its concept of industrial relations, especially its attitude toward unionism. 4. The responsibility of the labor manager is to provide some substitute for the interest and healthy relationship which usually exists between the small employer and his half-dozen workmen, but which become impossible in a large-scale business where the real employer is a considerable group of executives managing thousands of workers according to certain established principles, systems, and policies. 17. Governmental interference. 1. Under a general theory of minimum interference by the government in economic matters, the state protects and defines property rights, enforces contracts, and carries on certain activities which force it into business relations. 2. During an emergency such as war or the situations produced by war, the government sometimes uses its influence, without coercion, to secure greater coordination of economic effort for the social good. The first and second industrial conferences of President Wilson's Secretary Hoover's Unemployment Conference, the Anthracite Coal Commission of 1902, State Boards of Arbitration, the Federal Industrial Relations Commission are examples. 3. Beyond these advisory or non-coercive devices, government interference with industry takes 3 chief forms: state regulation, state operation, and taxation. 4. State regulation, as in the compulsory arbitration arrangements in Australia, New Zealand, and Kansas, is advocated particularly in those employments where cessation of operation is of special hardship to the public as in public utilities. It leads to standardization of industrial relations and is preferred by some to union regulation as the lesser of 2 evils. 5. Labor legislation limits the right of free contract out of consideration for the public interest and tends toward standardization. It is a recognition of the insufficiency of free bargaining to provide for public needs. 6. Our government is founded on the 18th century theory of industrial freedom, unrestricted enterprise and competition, protection of personal and property rights, and the prevalence of economic law. Unionism stands for regulation, the coercion of the individual, and very modified ideas of personal and property rights. This conflict of theories places unions in opposition to the law and legal procedure at many points, particularly in the matter of interference with industrial operations. 7. The injunction is a legal device for the protection of people against trespass upon their rights. The unions believe they have a right to trespass upon the legal rights of the employer, particularly in hindering him by picketing from hiring workers to replace strikers. 18. Workers also proprietors, cooperation, guild socialism. 1. As business organizations become institutionalized and their operations more or less standardized, the relevancy of proprietorship diminishes and the tendency to force management to assume even greater responsibility for public and employee welfare increases. The government may even find it advisable to take over functions of management and to administer them through commissions or boards. 2. This dissipation of proprietorship with its control over industry tends also to take the form of social control by and in the interests of special groups. Cooperative enterprises, usually starting in the field of distribution, democratize proprietorship. 3. Under a system of free enterprise, there is opportunity for any group of persons discontented with the system to organize a business institution according to their own ideas. Guild socialism is a system by which the workers undertake the responsibilities of management, especially in industries where contracting is practicable. XIX. Radicalism. 1. Industrialism divorces an ever-increasing proportion of the population from dependence upon natural resources for incomes by transferring their dependence to industry. Industry is composed of business institutions operated for the profit of the proprietors and only incidentally for the benefit of other interests. The private enterprise of proprietors varies with the opportunity for profits and produces a very irregular opportunity for workers dependent for incomes on the industry, thus creating periodical unemployment. 2. The mass of workers, dependent upon the uncertain ties of enterprise for their livelihoods and living under conditions very discouraging to savings and the accumulation of capital, constitute the proletariat. 3. In the earlier stages of industrialism, as in Russia today, the proletariat are not completely detached from natural resources. When unfavorable conditions cut them off from the business institution which has been the source of their incomes, they fall back upon natural resources for at least a bare subsistence through family cooperation. 4. Radicalism is the natural product of industrialism. Business institutions, upon which the proletariat depend, are social organizations susceptible to human control, and thus different from natural resources. All the collective desire for higher standards of livelihood and the energy created thereby tends to express itself in radical programs for a change in the business system, usually for greater social control and responsibility for the welfare of the proletariat. 5. Socialism would substitute the political for the business mode of operating industrialism, or extend the present scope of political government further into industry, displacing private enterprise and proprietorship. 6. Syndicalism and kindred radical movements aim to destroy the present economic system by revolution instead of substituting another mode or method for the existing one. Communism and the dictatorship of the proletariat are the extreme types of radicalism. 20. Religious ideals in industry. 1. Industrial relations, determining to such a large degree the conditions of life of the people, greatly influence the intellectual and spiritual life and are in turn much influenced by it. There seems to be a progressive tendency toward modifying industrial relations to make them more harmonious with and helpful to intellectual and spiritual life. 2. It may be that the present social fermentation is the process of working out an equilibrium between the material, intellectual, and spiritual interests of men in which all may find its proper realization. 3. Christianity includes a prescription for the adjustment of human relations expressed in the Golden Rule. It is the antithesis of natural law which has formed an economic system with its competition, survival of the fittest, struggle for existence, materialism, bargaining, and might make right concepts. 4. The Church, whose duty it is to promote Christian ideals, encounters great difficulty in entering the field of industrial relations. Because of the incompatibility of ideals, it appears to be impairing the efficiency of the delicately articulated industrial machine wherever it interferes. 5. Although the ideals and administrative practices of business as such are quite incompatible with the golden rule of the law of love, they accomplish a certain degree of material welfare for humanity, while interference with or neglect of economic laws frequently creates a condition even less favorable to spiritual life. 21. Social reconstruction. 1. The idea of social reconstruction is founded on the belief that the business organization of industry, based on the acquisitive motive, is inherently defective and is therefore bound to destroy itself. It seeks a method of right organization which shall better satisfy the purpose of human life. 2. Social reconstruction may be either evolutionary or revolutionary in temper. If evolutionary, it proposes to effect its object by a gradual, step-by-step process, as the minds of men can be educated and their interests adjusted to the changes. If revolutionary, it proposes to clear away the present system at a stroke, so that a new system can be installed without compromises. 3. The limiting factor in social improvement is always the general level of ideals which determine the conduct of men. These ideals are formed by education. Therefore, education is the means by which mankind will be emancipated from the materialistic limitations of this life. This brings into the field of industrial relations the agencies which educate the people: the schools, universities, churches, the platform, and the press.